The sun was beginning to dip below the skyline, casting long, amber shadows across the linoleum floor of Arturo's watch repair. Elias was 64, and his hands, though spotted with age, were as steady as a surgeon's. He sat hunched over his workbench, a jeweler's loupe pressed to his eye. Before him lay a vintage 1950s Omega, a beautiful piece of machinery that had been silenced for 20 years. The problem? The owner, a young woman named Maya, had brought it in a week ago. It belonged to her grandfather, a man who had survived the Atlantic crossing with nothing but this watch. She didn't want it polished, she didn't want it new. She just wanted to hear it heartbeat again. Elias had replaced the mainspring and cleaned the dried, gummy oil from the gears, but the balance wheel, the soul of the watch, refused to swing. The breakthrough, he picked up a tiny pair of brass tweezers. He felt the weight of the silence in the shop. Most people today used their phones to check the time. They didn't understand that a mechanical watch is a living thing. If you don't wind it, if you don't care for it, it dies. He noticed a microscopic burr on the escape wheel, a tiny imperfection, likely from a drop decades ago. With a breath he didn't realize he was holding, Elias used a fine Arkansas stone to smooth the metal. He reassembled the bridge, gave the crown a gentle twist, and held his breath. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was rhythmic and metallic, a tiny heartbeat echoing against the wooden bench. Elias let out a long sigh, his shoulders finally dropping from his ears. He checked it against the atomic clock on the wall. It wasn't just moving, it was keeping perfect time. The moment of truth. An hour later, the bell above the door jingled. Maya walked in, looking tired from a long shift at the hospital. "Any luck?" she asked, her voice hopeful but braced for disappointment. Elias didn't say anything. He simply picked up the Omega and laid it on the velvet counterpad. He pushed it toward her. Maya leaned in. In the quiet of the shop, the tick-tick-tick was unmistakable. She closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. "He used to hold this to my ear when I was a kid to help me sleep," she whispered. "I haven't heard that sound since the funeral." "It's a strong movement," Elias said softly, wiping his glasses. It just needed someone to listen to what was stopping it. As she paid and left, the shop felt a little less dusty, a little less old. Elias watched her go, then turned back to his bench. He picked up the next ticket, a broken Timex, and picked up his loupe. The world kept spinning, but in this corner of the city, time was back on track. The next morning, the rhythm of the shop felt different. Usually, Elias worked in a vacuum of silence, but today the tick of the Omega lingered in his mind like a catchy tune you can't shake. He arrived at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the open sign usually flipped. As he reached for his keys, he noticed a man standing by the brick pillar of the neighboring bakery. He was tucked into a heavy wool coat, looking at a small, handwritten slip of paper. "We don't open until 8, Elias said, his voice gravelly from the morning air. "I'm not in a rush," the man replied. He looked to be about Elias's age, but his posture was brittle. He held out the slip. It was a receipt from Arturo's, yellowed, frayed at the edges, and dated August 12, 1994. The ghost in the drawer. Elias unlocked the door and ushered him in. The smell of old oil and cold metal greeted them. "My name is Julian," the man said, his eyes scanning the walls of clocks. "My wife dropped something off here 32 years ago. She passed away shortly after. I found this in the back of a jewelry box last night." Elias went to the back room. Behind the modern filing cabinet stood a heavy oak chest, the dead files. It was where his mentor, Arturo, kept the pieces that were never claimed. Some were forgotten. Some were from families who had moved away or disappeared into the cracks of the city. He pulled the drawer for 94. He ran his fingers over the envelopes until he found it. Number 4412, silver locket watch. The unclaimed time. Elias brought the small, tarnished silver sphere to the counter. It was covered in a thick layer of oxidation, looking more like a lead fishing weight than a timepiece. He opened it with a specialized blade. Inside, the dial was pristine, protected from the air for 3 decades. But it wasn't the watch that stopped Elias's heart. It was the engraving on the inside of the casing. "For the time we haven't had yet, J&L. She was going to give it to me for our anniversary," Julian whispered, his fingers trembling as he touched the silver. "I thought it was lost. I thought I'd lost everything of hers." The work begins. Elias didn't ask for a deposit. He didn't even check his ledger. He simply pulled his lamp closer and gestured to the stool in the corner. "Stay," Elias said firmly. "The movement is seized, but the gears are solid." It's just been waiting. For the next 3 hours, the two men sat in a companionable, heavy silence. Elias worked with a focused intensity he hadn't felt in years. He disassembled the tiny caliber, soaking the pieces in a cleaning solution that smelled of ammonia and history. As he worked, Julian told him stories, not the big ones, but the small, realistic ones. How she hated the crust on toast. How she whistled when she was nervous. The connection. At noon, Elias clicked the back casing shut. He didn't just wind it, he set the time to the exact second. He handed it back. Julian held the locket to his ear. The sound was faint, a delicate, rapid flutter. "You don't owe me for the storage," Elias said before Julian could reach for his wallet. "The watch has been sitting in the dark for 30 years. It's earned its keep." As Julian walked out into the bright sun, he wasn't looking at the watch, his thumb tracing the engraving. Elias stood at the window for a long time. He realized that his shop wasn't just a place where machines were fixed. It was a place where people came to reclaim the parts of themselves they thought were gone. He looked down at his own hands. They were still steady. Elias is starting to see his work in a new light. The bell didn't ring again for the rest of the afternoon. The street outside grew gray with the threat of a winter slush, and for the first time in years, the silence of the shop felt heavy rather than peaceful. Elias locked up at 5 p.m. sharp. He lived only 6 blocks away, a walk he took every day regardless of the weather. He passed the deli, the laundromat, and the florist, his mind still stuck on the engraving in Julian's locket. For the time we haven't had yet. The apartment. Elias's apartment was exactly what you'd expect from a man who spent his life looking through a magnifying glass. It was tidy, sparse, and smelled faintly of cedar and black tea. In the hallway, there was a small mahogany table. On it sat a framed photograph of a woman with dark, curly hair and a laugh caught mid-air. Her name was Clara. She had been gone for 8 years. But in the stillness of the flat, Elias still found himself waiting for the sound of her keys in the door. He didn't turn on the television. Instead, he went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. The box in the closet. Usually, Elias spent his evenings reading history books, but tonight he went to the bedroom closet. He reached onto the top shelf and pulled down a shoebox labeled Parts Non-Functional. He brought it to the kitchen table. Inside wasn't a collection of gears or springs, but a mess of letters, theater stubs, and a small, velvet-covered box. He opened the box to reveal a lady's wristwatch, a delicate Cartier with a cracked crystal and a snapped leather band. It was the one watch Elias had never been able to fix. Not because he lacked the skill, but because he hadn't been able to bring himself to touch it. It was the watch Clara had been wearing the night the car hit the black ice. The hands were frozen at 11:14. The decision. Elias sat there for a long time, the steam from his tea curling into the dim light. He had spent his day giving time back to Maya and Julian, treating their memories with the reverence of a priest. Yet he had kept his own history frozen in a shoebox. He picked up the Cartier. The crystal was webbed with fractures, obscuring the elegant Roman numerals. To a watchmaker, a stopped watch is a failure. To a grieving man, it's a monument. He walked over to his small home workbench, a miniature version of the one at the shop. He clicked on the lamp. With a pair of fine-tipped pliers, he began to remove the broken leather strap. His hands, usually so steady, had a slight tremor. He took a deep breath, centered himself, and pried open the case back. The movement inside was mangled. A tiny screw had sheared off and lodged itself in the escapement. It was a mess. It was impossible. The first movement. He worked until 2 a.m. He didn't have the spare parts he needed, so he did something Arturo would have called heresy, illegally cannibalizing a high-end movement from another vintage watch in his collection to save the heart of this one. When the screw finally released and the gear train was cleared, Elias didn't wind it. He didn't set it to 11:14, and he didn't set it to the current time. Instead, he polished the gold casing until it shone. He replaced the cracked crystal with a spare he'd been saving for a special occasion. He set the watch down on the table. It was silent. It was still. But it was ready. He realized then that he didn't need to hear it tick to know it was fixed. He just needed to know that it wasn't broken anymore. Elias went to bed, and, for the first time in 8 years, he didn't check the clock on his nightstand to see how many hours of sleep he had left. He just closed his eyes. The sun is rising on a new day. The next morning, Elias didn't go to the shop. He woke up to the sound of a garbage truck grinding gears down in the street, but instead of the usual bolt of "I'm late" adrenaline, he felt a strange, heavy stillness. He looked at the Cartier on his workbench. It was beautiful, silent, and waiting. He didn't put on his suit vest. He put on an old wool sweater and a coat he usually only wore for funerals. Then, he did something he hadn't done in a decade. He walked past the subway entrance and kept going toward the harbor. The unexpected encounter. The pier was whipped by a biting salt wind. Elias stood by the railing, watching the gray Atlantic heave against the pilings. He felt like a man who had spent his whole life underwater and had finally broken the surface to find the air was much colder than he remembered. The tide's coming in fast today. Elias turned. Standing a few feet away was Maya, the young woman from the first day. She wasn't in her hospital scrubs. She was wearing a bright yellow raincoat that made her look like a beacon against the gray sky. "The girl with the Omega," Elias said, surprised. "The man who saved it," she smiled, but it was a tired smile. She was holding a small paper bag from a nearby bakery. "I come here after my double shifts. The sound of the waves, it drowns out the monitors and the beeping. The handover." They stood in silence for a moment, two strangers connected by a ticking heartbeat in her pocket. "I have a question for you, Elias," she said, looking out at the water. "Why do you do it? In a world that's moving so fast, why spend your life fixing things that people are just going to lose or break again?" Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out the Cartier. "I used to think I fixed them so they'd never stop," he said, turning the gold watch over in his palm. "But I realized last night that's not it. We don't fix things to make them last forever. We fix them so they can be used for the time we do have." He held the watch out to her. "The strap is gone, and the movement is delicate," Elias said. "But it works. I'd like you to have it. Not to keep, but to give to someone. Someone at your hospital. Someone who thinks their time has run out." The surprise, Maya looked at the watch, then at Elias. Her eyes widened. "Elias, I can't take this. This is a Cartier. This is worth thousands. It's worth nothing if it stays in a shoebox in my closet," he replied firmly. "I've spent 40 years hoarding time. I'd like to start spending it." He didn't wait for her to argue. He turned and started walking back toward the city, his hands deep in his pockets. He felt lighter with every step. The shop door. When he finally reached Arturo's watch repair at noon, there was a crowd of people waiting. Not for repairs, but because a local blogger had posted a photo of Julian, the man with the silver locket, holding his watch to his ear with a caption that had gone viral. "The man who found 30 years." Elias looked at the closed sign. He looked at the tools waiting for him inside. Then, he looked at the bakery next door. He didn't open the shop. Instead, he walked into the bakery, bought a coffee and a croissant, and sat at a window table where he could watch the people go by. He didn't check his wrist. He didn't look at the clock on the wall. He just sat there, watching the world happen in real time. Elias has stepped away from the workbench for the first time. Elias finished his coffee, but he didn't head home. Instead, he walked back to his shop door, flipped the sign to open, and did something he had never done in 40 years of business. He grabbed a piece of cardboard and a thick black marker. In steady block letters, he wrote, "No repairs today. Just stories." He taped it to the front glass. The shift! The crowd outside, mostly young people with iPhones in hand and a few older locals, looked confused. One by one, they trickled in. They didn't find a man ready to take their money or issue a claim ticket. They found Elias sitting on a stool in front of the counter, his workbench pushed to the side. "I'm not fixing gears today," he announced to the small group. "But if you have something in your pocket that means something to you, even if it's broken, even if it's not a watch, tell me why you keep it. I want to know what you're holding on to." A young man in a leather jacket stepped forward. He pulled out a rusted bent house key. "This doesn't open anything anymore," he said, his voice quiet. "It's to my dad's old garage. He sold the house 5 years ago, but I can't throw it away." Elias nodded, leaning in. "Why?" "What was in the garage?" "Everything," the boy whispered. "The smell of sawdust. The radio playing baseball games. It's where I learned that things can be built if you have patience." Elias smiled. "Then the key still works. It opens your memory. That's a different kind of mechanism." The apprentice. In the back of the shop stood a girl, no older than 20, with grease-stained fingers and a vintage tool roll tucked under her arm. She had been waiting for 3 hours. Her name was Clara, not the Clara Elias had lost, but a girl named after a grandmother who had been a clockmaker in the Black Forest. She hadn't come for a story. She had come for a job. When the shop finally cleared out at dusk, she approached the counter. She didn't say a word. She simply took a small brass alarm clock from her bag, disassembled it with lightning speed on the counter, and put it back together in less than 3 minutes. Elias watched her. He saw the way she handled the tweezers, the same reverence, the same steady hand. "You're late," Elias said, his voice gruff but kind. "For what?" she asked. "To start. I'm not going to be here much longer. I have some traveling to do," he said, looking at a map of the coast on the wall. "But this shop needs someone who knows that a clock doesn't just tell the time, it keeps it safe." The final tick. Elias handed her his loop, the one he'd used for 30 years. "The sign says, 'No repairs today,'" she reminded him, looking at the cardboard in the window. Elias grabbed the marker again. He crossed out "today" and wrote "alone." "No repairs alone." He walked to the back, put on his hat and headed for the door. For the first time in his life, Elias wasn't worried about the seconds ticking away. He realized that time isn't a resource you use up, it's a space you inhabit. As he stepped out into the cool evening air, he heard it. From inside the shop, the girl had started winding the grandfather clock in the corner. The deep, resonant chime echoed down the street, signaling not the end of the day, but the beginning of a different era. Elias is finally free to travel. Elias didn't go to the village where he was born, nor did he head for the Italian coast Clara had always pinned to their fridge. Instead, he withdrew his life savings, bought a rugged, used Land Rover, and drove north, straight into the heart of the Canadian wilderness where the roads turned to gravel and then to nothing. The cabin in the Barrens. 2 weeks later, Elias sat on the porch of a cabin so remote that the nearest neighbor was a 3-hour hike away. He wasn't there to relax. He was there because of a letter he had found tucked into the very back of Arturo's dead files on his final day. A letter addressed to him, dated 40 years ago, in Arturo's own shaky handwriting. The letter had contained only a set of coordinates and a single sentence. The great machine is waiting, and only a steady hand can stop the countdown. The discovery: behind the cabin was a heavy steel hatch, hidden under layers of pine needles and frozen dirt. Elias had spent 3 days clearing it. Now, with a crowbar and the last of his strength, he heaved it open. He descended a rusted ladder into a vault that smelled of ozone and ancient brass. As his flashlight beam cut through the dark, his breath hitched. It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a weapon. It was a clock, but one the size of a cathedral. Huge, gold-plated gears the size of truck tires hung suspended from the ceiling. Thousands of tiny, silver pendulums swung in perfect, terrifying unison. It was the Master Clock, a legendary mechanical computer rumored to have been built by a secret society of horologists to track something far more important than hours and minutes. The malfunction. Elias climbed the central catwalk. In the very heart of the machine, he saw it. A single massive gear, the one that controlled the centennial cycle, was vibrating violently. A hairline fracture was spreading across its surface. If that gear shattered, the entire mechanism would seize. According to Arturo's notes, this clock didn't just track time, it synchronized it. Elias pulled his toolkit from his belt. He looked at the fracture, then at the sheer scale of the machine. His steady hands felt small. He reached out to touch the vibrating metal, but as he did, his flashlight caught something he hadn't seen before. At the base of the fractured gear, there was a digital display, the only piece of modern tech in the entire room. It was a countdown timer, glowing in a harsh electric red. 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 3 seconds. 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 2 seconds. 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 1 second. Elias gripped his wrench, his heart hammering against his ribs like a broken mainspring. As the timer hit 0, the deafening roar of the gears suddenly stopped. The silence was absolute. Outside the vault, the wind stopped howling. The birds stopped mid-flight. Elias looked down at his own wrist. The second hand on his watch didn't just stop. It began to spin rapidly, violently, backward. Then, a voice echoed from the shadows of the vault, a voice that sounded exactly like Clara's. "You're late, Elias. We've been waiting for you to fix the beginning." Elias stares into the darkness of the vault, his heart stopping as the world outside vanishes into a white void. What happens when the master clock resets?